So there's a newspaper in Long Island, New York, that's called Newsday. Long Island, just so you know, is massive. It's got millions of people. And in New York City, there's the New York Times, the New York Post, the New York Daily News, all based in the city, all these things we think of as New York papers. But out on Long Island, where there are millions of people, forever it's been New York Newsday. On Long Island, New York Newsday is a big paper, a big circulation. It is indisputably the paper of record, and it has been there forever. And I actually mean that literally. Local laws all over the country require the publication of public notices in the paper of record. So this is notices about upcoming public hearings, about proposed laws, real estate transactions, stuff like that. We don't really have classified ads the way we used to in newspapers, but there's still a bunch of fine print notices in major papers, and those are often public notices that are required by law in the local paper of record. And those public notices are a considerable source of income for local newspapers. So on Long Island, in Nassau County, Long Island, the county government there is headed up by an elected county executive. And in Nassau County, the county executive is a Trump guy. So much so that, perhaps feeling a little jealous that Trump has his Oath Keepers and his Proud Boys, pro-Trump paramilitary militias, this county executive on Long Island has also formed his own semi-official paramilitary force of military and law enforcement veterans that he says he wants to be able to call up on his own orders to supplement official law enforcement. Now, if that puts a little shiver in your quiver, it's because you're paying attention. But that same very, very Trumpy county official in Long Island, New York, has now yanked all public notices from Newsday, from the paper of record in Long Island, and instead has started putting public notices instead in a right-wing New York City tabloid that's not even based in Long Island. Newsday is suing to get the public notices back. But we'll see. So that's one. Here's a second story. This is the second part of the same story. You might have also seen headlines recently about Trump's new FCC chair going after NPR and PBS. Now, I recognize you might have skipped past those headlines because they look familiar. Every time a Republican's in the White House, they always say they're going to go after NPR and PBS. And every time Americans rise up and say, you know, leave Big Bird alone and leave NPR alone, we freaking use it and we like it and go mess with something else. This time, though, did you see how exactly they're going after them? They've decided to go out a different way this time. They've opened an investigation into how NPR and PBS stations state on the air who their underwriters are. NPR and PBS are public broadcasting, so they don't accept ads per se, but they do accept sponsorships. And when you're watching something on PBS or listening to something on NPR, you will hear them tell you who their sponsors are. It's part of how NPR and PBS stations stay financially viable and sustainable and, honestly, locally grounded in their local communities because a lot of their underwriting is from local businesses. Right? I mean, if you've ever listened or watched public media, you know this. They do pledge drives to raise money from people who join as members. They also get local organizations and local businesses to sponsor their programs. So you get, like, you know, this hour of jazz and classical music brought to you by your local Ford dealer or whatever. But that is what they're going after them for this time. They're saying that their underwriting is somehow wrong. The way they state the names of their underwriters, that's illegal somehow. And this is a new approach. This is not the usual blunt force Republican attack of threatening to take away their federal funding. Federal funding only makes up a fraction of the budgets of NPR and PBS. No, they're doing it differently this time. They're actually going at they're going at the way these stations are sustainably and locally making money to keep their programs on the air, right? Because actually that funding is more important to NPR and PBS stations than federal funding is. And so, yeah, go at the thing that makes them their most money. Go at the thing that actually makes them viable. I mean, if these guys can stop the thing that makes these stations actually most of their money, that is a better way to cripple the high-quality, gold standard, independent U.S. journalism and programming of NPR and PBS. That's a better way to do it than just threatening to cut off the fraction of their funds that come technically from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and taxpayer money. So that's another. You might also have seen headlines about the move at the Defense Department to take away office space used at the Pentagon by correspondents from the New York Times and NBC News and other major news organizations. Now, it does not mean that these news outlets are banned from covering the Pentagon. It just means they can't cover the Pentagon as well as they do now. I mean, they'll be allowed to attend briefings and, get emails or whatever, make phone calls. But they are no longer allowed to be based there at the Pentagon so they can be there all around the clock while decisions are being made and things are happening. They can't do that anymore. That office space has been there for Pentagon correspondents for decades. But in the Trump administration, they're pulling it from well-established, competent, independent news organizations that they don't like and that they would like to hurt. All of these stories are the same story. Right? This is not just your typical political thing where you've got somebody in the White House or somebody in politics complaining about press coverage. It's not even the typical thing with Trump calling the press the enemy of the people or whatever Stalinist thing he's onto now. This is what they call the Viktor Orban playbook for using the power of government to eliminate independent, credible, professional journalism. Using the power of government to hurt journalism as much as possible, to weaken it as much as possible, to try to drive independent, capable professional media out of business and into ruin so that it goes away. And the only thing that's left is, for lack of a better term, state TV. In September, a few weeks before the election, the publisher of the New York Times wrote a long op-ed, and in a sort of gesture of solidarity, I think, he published it not in his own paper, but in the Washington Post. So it's the Times publisher publishing something in the Washington Post. And it was a really important piece. It was about what he thinks, at least, we should have been expecting if an authoritarian-minded Donald Trump returned to the White House and was determined to do to the press what he had been promising to do to the press through his first term. The warning basically was that Trump would probably try to do something to the press in this country along the same lines of what Viktor Orban did to the press in his country, in Hungary, when he destroyed the free press there as part of his takeover as a de facto dictator. It said this, quote, "He can't simply close newspapers or imprison journalists. Instead, he sets about undermining independent news organizations in subtler ways, using bureaucratic tools such as tax law, broadcast licensing, and government contracting. Meanwhile, he rewards news outlets that toe the party line, shoring them up with state advertising revenue and tax exemptions and other government subsidies. He helps friendly business people buy up other weakened news outlets at cut rates to turn them into government mouthpieces. Within a few years, only pockets of independence remain in the country's news media, freeing the leader from perhaps the most challenging obstacle to his increasingly authoritarian rule. Instead, the nightly news and broadsheet headlines unskeptically parrot his claims, often unmoored from the truth, flattering his accomplishments while demonizing and discrediting his critics. Quote, whoever controls a country's media, the leader's political director asserts, quote, controls the country's mindset, and through that, the country itself. This is the short version of how Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, effectively dismantled the news media in his country. This effort was a central pillar of Orban's broader project to remake his country as an illiberal democracy. A weakened press made it easier for him to keep secrets, to rewrite reality, to undermine political rivals, to act with impunity, and ultimately to consolidate unchecked power in ways that left the nation and its people worse off. It's a story that is being repeated in eroding democracies all around the world. And it is a story that is being aped right now by the second Donald Trump presidential term. And this is not yet being treated as one of the things the new Trump administration is doing, but they are doing it. And they are using both the federal government and allies outside government to do it. And if the model holds, I expect that what we're going to see is a big spike in defamation cases brought against various media companies, particularly now that so many companies are settling them and paying rather than fighting them. We will see a systematic litigation effort, I believe, to undo libel law in this country. The decades-old precedent called New York Times v. Sullivan. The goal of undoing that precedent will be to make it easier for truly ruinous lawsuits to be brought against news organizations, whether or not they're brought in good faith. If they can succeed in restructuring defamation and libel law in this country, which they are trying to do, it will result in a restructured legal environment where news organizations really can't win. And yeah, you can have the government come after them, but you can also have the president's allies in private life come after them in ways that are designed to financially weaken, cripple, and ultimately shut down or cause to be sold the oppositional independent media in this country. We have a free, oppositional, independent, aggressive, often annoying and pushy press in this country, which you may not always like. But it is how we learn what the government is doing. And it's the main reason why the government has to answer questions about what they're doing. Support for professional, independent, and even oppositional media has never been more important. We are seeing a wall-to-wall strategy start to gear up to try to blow up the press and effectively just have state TV from here on out. It is a concerted effort.